He woke up in a sweat. Not the freezing kind, just the kind that tugs at your neck and warns you that you've been too warm for too long. A drop rolled down his forehead, already beginning to fade faster than his tangled dreams. Blurs on the edges of his vision were all that remained of those dreams, but they creeped away with the darkness as bright blue filled the inside of his eyelids. In a second, it was gone. Then it reappeared, just as bright as before. Gone the next moment. On, off, on, off, on, off. Each time accompanied by the quietest bzzzt and the occasional clunk. Through a cracking eyelid, the distant words drew him in like a whirlpool. Sandy's smokes. Cigarettes, lighters, scratchers. We got what you need. They disappeared, then reappeared. Then disappeared again and again, each time molding more and more to the surrounding shadow. A groan came from somewhere, but he wasn't so sure it was from him. The walls there were so thin it could have been from someone 10 floors up, and it would sound just as near. He was acutely aware of every one of his tired muscles stretching and aching, trying to shake off the tosses and turns. Purely on instinct, his hand crawled up the musty, roughly strewn blanket to a pile that he knew to be his trench coat, even in the dark. Inside one of the pockets, past a spent sheet of paper long since faded with age. A cheap, worn cigarette box, and the cool metal of the lighter. One of the crooked smokes found itself between his lips before he'd had time to blink, not needing any light to see or seconds to feel, having done that exact motion 1,000 times before. A metal flick, then bright orange fought off the intermittent waves of neon blue. He stared at the weak flame for a moment, watching its minute movements closely. It leaned to the left, then to the right, then was still for a moment before jerking back and forth erratically. It hated sitting still. He held his cigarette up to it, in an attempt to placate the flame, to draw its attention to something else for a moment besides its somber, indecisive dance. It almost seemed to work, as the end of the paper glowed red-hot. Then it returned to its twisting and shaking. A metal clink extinguished the spot of bright orange in the room, and the blue flooded in once again. The familiar sound of the bed springs creaking and groaning filled the silence as he sat up and faced in the direction of the door. Where was I? Was the single thought that buzzed in his head. The clock sitting beside him, unobtrusively ticking the seconds away, read 3:41 in the morning. Faded visions of the night before rised in front of him, which he tried grabbing at with limited success. He saw a few glass bottles, stacks of paper, coffee rings, a handful of bullet casings, bright red lips, a cushioned couch, a hand tugging at his loose tie, all through a thick haze of smoke, at least part of which he knew to be his own. The rest melted away into the watching darkness, dissipating like dust on the air. Can't sleep. No good. He mumbled to no one. The stained carpet softened his footsteps as he hobbled to the open window, his eyes squinting to adjust to the sudden brightness of Sandy's sign. A quiet valley formed between the brick and concrete sprawled out below. Not exactly brimming with life, but not completely barren of it either. That he expected. No matter when it was, or where it was, one thing about the city you could always count on was that there were always a few lost souls wandering around. At this hour, they drifted like ghosts, limped like zombies, crawled like worms. Each and every one of them just trying to live until morning any way they knew how. Some streets away, a couple of car horns blared. An explosive bang echoed between the alleyways, followed by another and another. Tinny ringing just across the street signaled the first of the day's customers at Sandy's. A silky female voice cried out from behind a wall to a shape moving in the dark. "You looking for somewhere warm to spend the night?" The shape responded with something like, "Whore," and shuffled through a thick cloud lingering on the sidewalk. The gentle pattering of a few raindrops hit the windowsill, the street, the sign, the entire expanse of the urban jungle at once. He breathed in, taking in the tobacco in his nose and the stale vodka on his breath. A moment in time then was taken from the rest, a snapshot in his mind of what he usually thought was the best part of living where he did. The city had its own voice, its own discordant and haunting melody that always managed to harmonize with itself. It was the sound her inhabitants endlessly attempted to encapsulate with their pianos and trumpets and saxophones, without ever getting to the essence of it. That hum of life, that elusive heartbeat that pumped meaning and smoke and cheap liquor through every corner and crevice. The improvised rhythm that caused every step, opened every bottle, shot every bullet, broke every heart, and paid every cent, was one of the most beautiful things he'd ever heard. Once upon a time. Now, as he stood alone at the window and spectated his world, things were more muted. Like the black ink of the notes on the sheet music were fading with time. Maybe it was the brisk drizzle beginning the process of washing the paint off the roads and walls. His own drag of his cigarette put his mind at ease. The sweet smoke filled his mouth, crawled down his throat, pervaded his lungs, flowed through his veins and arteries. It stung just slightly as it went down, the pleasurable thorn on the candy rose that hurt just the way he needed it to. He kept it suspended there to spread through every corner of his body and mind for just a little longer. Then, he released the cloud all at once into the night, letting it roam free around his face before it disappeared forever. Bright and hot became black and flaky. Then the scarlet ring suddenly disappeared into the night. A single frigid drop flinging off the end of the cigarette and onto his hand. Smoke thickened, then was gone too as it leaked into the night sky. Somehow not startled or surprised, he flicked the now useless roll of paper to the sidewalk below. With nothing to occupy his hands, he found himself stumbling to the bed and swiping in the blackness underneath for any stray bottles he might have forgotten. Fingers found cool glass, which was followed by scraping and clinking. In the dim light where the bright blue of the sign didn't reach, he couldn't see how much was left in the tall bottle, but just by swinging it around, he somehow knew there wasn't a single drop left. A damn shame, considering it was his last bottle that he had on hand. His eyes shifted to the ticking clock again. At this hour, no liquor store would be open. For a drink, he'd have to go all the way to the bar. He must have moved as fast as a smoking bullet because he couldn't quite remember how he'd gotten from his room to the stairwell so quickly, trench coat over his shoulders and faded fedora on his matted hair. Except for the echoing clicking of his heels, all was silent. Before he left, his hand quickly searched in his inner coat pocket, feeling for that spent sheet of paper that he knew was always there but had made a habit of checking up on. The creaking door of the apartment building led him to the quiet street, where he took a right and nearly meandered into the nightlife of the city, had he not kept his mind focused on some fuzzy image of a glass filling with vodka at a bar. Just a little while longer. The sign stuck out from a mile away. Neon Nights, the go-to nightclub on the east side of 51st. It was open all hours and certainly was stocked up on anything and everything to drink. He knew the owner, naturally. Good old Lonnie Costello. He'd started the place as a speakeasy during the Prohibition days, but those days were long gone. All manner of customers, like the one who hobbled towards it now, had flocked in and stayed as regulars when Costello turned the place into a full-fledged nightclub. If there was anyone and anywhere that he could count on, it was Lonnie's Neon Nights. To him, there was no other place in the city quite like it. The interior was all too familiar to him. Soft lighting, ornate wood paneling, numerous chairs and tables and stools keeping the place feeling just crowded enough. Of course, no nightclub was complete without the late-night booze hounds haunting the booths with their dull chatter and stale stench. Somehow, that made it feel more homely. He found a lonely bar stool and rapped on the polished wood of the counter. Lonnie Costello greeted him with a warm smile. "Would you look at that? Almost had me worried you were dead. Wasn't feeling especially social. What, did you miss my business? I'm fond of my customers, so what?" He chuckled. "Never change, Lonnie." "I never do. The usual?" He nodded. A small glass appeared before him, followed by a tall bottle of vodka that had come directly from underneath the counter. It was on the rarer side, so Lonnie only offered it to customers who already knew about it. For the man now asking, it was his poison of choice. He watched it swirl around for a moment inside its glass walls before Lonnie poured it in. In a second, it was already crawling down his throat, leaving behind that all-too-familiar burning and tugging. It wasn't the smoothest in the world, but it sure as hell got him drunk the fastest. "Did you see the new canary?" Lonnie said, setting the bottle down. "Started just last week, but she's a hit. I'd wager business went up just 'cause of her." He registered for the first time the music that was coming from the opposite side of the nightclub. He'd never heard the song, but it was a slow and melancholy piece that he imagined might tug at his heartstrings on any night he was sober. Each word had some kind of magic charm behind it, one that made every clubgoer that night keep their eyes glued to the singer. No one would be able to deny that the song was beautiful. More than beautiful, even. Heavenly would be an understatement. Gods and angels wished they could produce such flawless notes with such ease. He didn't have to turn around to know who was behind the voice, but against his better judgment, he did anyway. Not many things in the city surprised him anymore, but the sight of her was just enough to make him stop his drink midway to his lips. The otherworldly woman took the stage, completely lost in the tune as she sung her soul into the microphone. Her silk velvet dress, either black or navy blue, but not so much either as to be deduced right away, was just form-fitting enough that he tapped his foot nervously as he saw the other men in the club stare. That was a feeling he hadn't felt in a long, long time. As he expected, she radiated nothing but pure glamour and high-end sensibilities. Nothing suited her more, and that's the way she preferred it. Though what she was doing there, he hadn't a clue. When the song reached its almost morose end, the crowd cried and cheered more rambunctiously than usual. Catcalls and drink offers flew back and forth across the room, but as was her nature, she held her chin high, put her shoulders back, and squinted so as to only see straight ahead as she left the stage. It didn't take a detective to know that she was a woman who did as she pleased, a sentiment he used to ponder often. Feeling as though he couldn't bear to see her for another second, he turned back around and stared into his glass again. A second later, the voice that the heavens gifted appeared next to him. "Dubonnet, please. Thanks, Lon." Lonnie got straight to work, as was his specialty. In just a minute, it was already in front of her. Out of the corner of her eye, she spied the man sitting a couple stools down, lapping up vodka like a thirsty dog. It didn't stop her from taking a sip, but it made her pause for just a moment. "That was always your favorite brand," she muttered. "As I recall, your favorite drink was the Angel's Kiss. Too sweet for you? Tastes change. Tell me about it." She was silent. Then, "Good to see you again." He hesitated. "You too. How have you been?" "What can I say? Hitting on all 8. They drank without saying anything for a time, both having far too much on their minds, but not knowing exactly how to express it. As he refilled his glass, one question came to the forefront of his mind. "What are you doing here, doll?" She let a faint smile break her nearly impenetrable facade. Her velvet-gloved fingertip traced the edge of her glass. Been a while since you called me that. I guess this doll had her dreams just like her playmate, but it seems like it didn't work out for either. Yeah? What makes you say that? You wouldn't be getting smoked at this hour by yourself if it had. Illusions of grandeur got the best of us, huh? I used to call it optimism. Seems like those days are behind us now. She stopped tracing. It sure didn't have to be that way. You know that, don't you, Copper? He continued to stare into his glass. The ice cubes clinked and cracked. I thought the same thing for years. Yeah? On and off. About what life might have been like if we still drank from the same bottle. Can I be honest? He looked in her eyes. I do too. Sometimes. There was something about those eyes. Steel gray, sad, always searching. She liked acting tough and aloof, like she could conquer the world. In every way she could. That's one of the things he loved about her. But only he knew the truth behind those quick back-and-forth movements that noted every feature of his face. A truth, he suspected, that had long been forgotten and abandoned. They stayed there for a long while. She looked away. So, being a famous singer didn't work out. Neither did becoming that world-class detective in the upper city. Right, Slick? He chuckled. Life has this funny way of doing whatever the hell it wants. Usually the opposite of what you want. I wager that's how you ended up here on a Saturday night instead of one of those fancy high-rise clip joints. Lonnie has good enough business for me. I'm surprised you settled. Nothing was good enough for us. Isn't that right? I suppose you could put it like that. Ain't that the reason we split in the first place? To pursue our dreams on our own time? Something like that. It's been so long I can hardly remember. But it might have been because you didn't make time for anything else. That's so. I seem to recall it was because you couldn't help but get into trouble by being a smartass all the time. As if that isn't the thing we have most in common, Lug. He paused. Yes, that's one thing you write about. After another few wordless minutes ticked by, he could only think of one thing to say. I'm sorry. Don't be. I am too. You've got nothing to be sorry about, dear. Life that is both in, I guess. Can a word make up for years of lost time? He took a moment to ponder on it. Then, reaching into his inner coat pocket, he brought out the spent sheet of paper, unfolded it, and laid it out on the table. Not sure, but this might. Although he always kept it close, it had been ages since he'd last seen what was on it. An immaculate drawing of them, lovingly illustrated on a paper that had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times from the hundreds of nights spent studying it. The creases were so worn that they might tear in a light breeze. Some boy had handed it to him in what seemed like a past life. The lovers were sitting outside at a cafe one sunny afternoon, chatting the hours away while the stranger was struck by inspiration upon seeing them, and drew the tender scene he saw. When he'd finished, he tapped the man's shoulder and gave him the drawing as a keepsake. He said he usually charged folks, but that one was on the house. Nothing had given him so much inspiration in a long time. All these years? Never left my sight. As they searched each other's eyes once again for all the solemn days and lonely nights they'd spent without each other, the man's thoughts were only filled with her voice, her divine notes, her effortless pitches, her stunning vibrato. Their fingers intertwined, and the only music in his ears was the voice of the city. Her voice was the essence of it. They were one. that hum of life, that improvised rhythm, the source of everything. It was her. And for once, it was perfectly harmonized.